Hey there all you beautiful guardians of the glaze. Welcome back to the Milky Donut. If you're new here, this is the Milky Donut. We do all things video games, movies, and pop culture. And if you're not new here, remember, it only lets you click the subscribe button if you're extremely attractive. So hello beautiful. Well, before we yet again jump back into our video game time travel machine, as always, I would like to mention that I do have a goal of reaching 25,000 subscribers as quickly as I can. So if you could go ahead and like this video, leave the glaziest of comments, hype it if you can, and subscribe if you think it's worthy of the algorithm. As always, shout out to the current subscriber of the week, Mr. JKM395, and stick around until the end of the video for the reveal of the brand new subscriber of the week, because it could very well be you. And with all that nonsense out of the way, let's jump back into our video game time travel machine and go back to our favorite celestial body planet, Zebes! Playing Metroid Zero Mission for the very first time has yet again allowed for a pretty unique perspective, because at this point I've somehow played enough Metroid games that I'm actually starting to have a bit of a history with this series, yet there's still so much more for me to experience. Super Metroid was my introduction to 2D Metroid, and what an introduction that was, because as you might know, it ended up not only becoming one of my favorite games that I've played within the Regress series, but one of my favorite games of all time, which is still wild to think about. But then I went all the way back to the original Metroid on the NES. Despite your guys' warnings about the rough edges, I played it anyways, which nearly killed me, but it also showed me just how much DNA of that incredible formula had already existed in 1986. Plus, it got me to hand draw my first ever map, so that was super cool. But most recently, Fusion took a lot of what I thought Metroid needed to do to be good, especially the aspects of the exploration and the feeling of complete isolation that I love so much in Super Metroid, and proved that the series could change considerably without losing its Metroid identity. And now we arrive here with Metroid Zero Mission, a game that goes all the way back to the beginning and completely rebuilds the original Metroid, utilizing almost 20 years of lessons Nintendo had learned since. Which I guess also means that technically, I've in a way already played this game before, or at least I had played the archaeological artifact that's buried underneath it. And that comparison was really what made this game so much fun to experience for me, because I recognized so much of what I was looking at without ever really feeling like I was just replaying the same exact adventure. As a matter of fact, it feels like a completely new game. I knew the areas and enemies such as Brinstar, Norfair, Kraid, Ridley, Mother Brain, and the basic structure of the journey I was about to embark on because, well, I'd already made my way through the considerably more hostile and confusing NES version with, like I said, a homemade map, use of the manual, and the internet whenever my sanity reached critically dangerous lows, and at the very least, several years removed from my expiration date. But right off the bat, Zero Mission felt like it was about to show me what that experience might have looked like if the technology and design knowledge behind later Metroid games had somehow existed during the era of Nestroid. Now, for those of you who haven't seen my Metroid video, first of all, check it out because it's a banger. But despite its very obvious clunkiness and age, I actually had a fun time with it, and I got a lot of good things out of the experience. But the basic setup here is still beautifully simple. Samus is sent to planet Zebes to, of course, stop the space pirates from utilizing Metroids as biological weapons, which means wandering your way through the planet, eventually defeating Kraid and Ridley, making your way to Tori, and thus eventually destroying Mother Brain. They didn't add on some convoluted afterthought of a narrative that's layered over the original either, which in my opinion was a very smart move. They just took the level design and made it absolutely phenomenal. After Fusion placed a much greater emphasis on dialogue and story, while yes, I did enjoy that, I very much enjoyed returning to this, say it with me, atmosphere. Zero Mission adds short cinematics such as Samus arriving on Zebes, Ridley approaching the planet, and the introduction of the Metroids, but they're over just about as quickly as they begin, and outside of maybe a few small moments, there's very little dialogue. Like I spoke about in my Fusion video, Fusion proved to me that a more narrative-heavy Metroid can absolutely work, even despite the worries I had going into it. But Zero Mission gives Samus's first ever adventure more narrative context without ever interrupting the exploration, which thank goodness, because you know how I feel about that. It also just feels a lot more appropriate for this particular type of story. And I will say that calling this the same Zebes I explored on the NES almost feels disrespectful because, good lord, did they do some hefty renovations on the level design. If you can recall, one of my biggest problems with the original Metroid was never the idea behind its world, because conceptually I thought its interconnected design was actually incredible for 1986, and the amount of ideas that were already present from the very beginning is actually kind of mind-blowing. But when it came to navigating that world, it could definitely at some points become exhausting when so many screens and rooms looked nearly identical. There were numerous times where I genuinely couldn't tell whether I had discovered somewhere new or if I just accidentally stumbled into a previous room from 2 hours ago. And that, combined with a complete absence of an in-game map, turned navigation into a game of memory that my brain was apparently not qualified to play. But Zero Mission keeps the basic geography and identity of those locations while making them feel like actual places. Brinstar actually feels like a proper opening area, and Norfair has the heat and environmental variety that I remembered from Super Metroid. Kraid and Ridley's layers also have considerably more personality, and the architecture and background details create visual landmarks instead of leaving me trapped inside of a void of confusion. And yes, ladies and gentlemen, there is finally a map. A beautiful, wonderful map. And you know what? After defending the original Metroid for not having one because manually learning Zebes eventually became such a major part of that experience for me, I was curious whether having one here would make the exploration feel too easy, but it really doesn't. Not completely, at least. It just removes the part where I need a master's degree in cartography in order to play Metroid. Chozo statues can also point you toward important destinations, and again, coming directly from Fusion, I immediately noticed how much lighter the guidance feels compared to Adam. Fusion usually gives you a pretty straightforward and clear destination with some context as to why you're going there, while Zero Mission pretty much just places a marker somewhere on the map and says, "Hey buddy, something important's over there, pal. Godspeed." And in reality, in most cases, you can just bypass them, so the guidance exists for somebody who might need it without forcing itself onto somebody who doesn't. And that middle ground works extremely well because I rarely experience that overwhelming confusion of the NES game where I had no idea whether I was progressing, yet I also never felt like Zero Mission was playing itself for me or holding my hand, and you definitely know how I feel about hand-holding. Because remember, I do still like to get lost and backtrack and figure out my way through on my own, so I didn't want that to be taken away by any means. Just like before, I could wander off because something caught my eye and return to an upgrade that I remembered seeing earlier, experiment with suspicioso looking walls, or spend 10 minutes attempting to reach something that I most likely wasn't supposed to be interacting with yet. And I usually felt rewarded for that curiosity. However, apparently that freedom goes considerably deeper than anything I had experienced during my playthrough of Nestroid, because Zero Mission was deliberately designed with sequence breaking in mind, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is how you do a remake. Hidden alternate routes allow experienced players to completely bypass certain items and bosses that a newer player would probably just assume are mandatory, which makes the world feel far more open to experimentation once you understand how everything fits together. But what can I say, boys and girls, I do love a game that can accommodate somebody like me, aka a noob, while leaving an exceptionally large mechanical ceiling for people who have been breaking Metroid and games alike for years, way before I ever even knew Samus was a baddie. Speaking of our girl Samus, our favorite intergalactic muscle mommy, she feels fantastic to play here. Super Metroid is still my favorite Metroid game and I absolutely love it, but I did briefly mention in that video that her movement did initially feel a tiny bit heavy yet floaty at the same time, which doesn't really make any sense. But anyways, every once in a while there was a tiny disconnect between what I wanted her to do and what actually happened. And while Fusion tightened up that movement with faster acceleration and more responsive controls, Zero Mission feels like the devs wanted to take that foundation and give Samus a nice frosty cold white monster, because good lord can this girl move, son. Running, shooting, and mechanics such as turning into the morph ball all feel incredibly responsive, something you loyal guardians know that I love. And her jump immediately feels different because once you jump, you come back down a lot faster than the slightly floatier Samus I knew from Super Metroid. Of course, it took a little bit of practice, which is usual, but once it clicked, even just traversing through Zebes became one of the most satisfying parts of the experience. And the best part is that increased speed doesn't come at the cost of mechanical depth, because wall jumping still makes your return here, bomb jumping feels considerably easier to comprehend and use, the speed booster and shine spark create all kinds of insane movement opportunities, half of which I wasn't even skilled enough to utilize, and the game feels perfectly comfortable letting skilled players, not me, abuse those mechanics. It reminded me of when I finished Super Metroid feeling pretty darn decent about myself, and then I watched some videos of speedrunners fly through the game like they had 17 fingers and access to a completely different set of controls that I didn't have. However, the difference here, at least to me, is that it feels like the devs deliberately designed parts of Zero Mission around that kind of mastery, which gives it this great combination of being extremely approachable at a surface level for noobs, while also having an absurd amount of depth sitting right beneath it for skilled players to absolutely break. And Milky likes that. The upgrades create yet another fascinating comparison between the other games I've played so far because in a weird way, I'm watching the evolution of Metroid's mechanics happen in reverse. Zero Mission begins by giving Samus roughly the same basic abilities she had back in Nestroid. But, of course, as the game progresses, it starts introducing abilities that wouldn't actually appear until later entries in the series. The Charge Beam, Power Grip, and Speed Booster join the returning upgrades that are present from the original, Super Missiles make a return, along with several mysterious upgrades that of which eventually become the Plasma Beam, Gravity Suit, and Space Jump later on in your adventure. So technically, I'm chronologically playing the beginning of Samus' story while controlling a version of her that was built nearly 20 years later, which is pretty cool if you ask me. Thankfully, however, that doesn't change the progression loop that of which caused me to fall in love with the Metroid series in the first place. You start off weak, and in typical Metroid fashion, large portions of the environment are inaccessible, and every new ability ever so slightly changes the way you interpret and move throughout planet Zebes. Super Metroid did an incredible job making me subconsciously remember places that I had seen hours earlier whenever I found a new upgrade. And Zero Mission captures that same satisfaction while making the process of backtraveling through the world considerably more efficient. Zero Mission is quite a bit more forgiving about getting you to wherever it is you need to go. Nestroid had me health grinding like nobody's business and desperately trying to preserve missiles, all while entering an unfamiliar area with the complete expectation of getting absolutely slimed. Whereas here, you get save rooms, ways to restore health and ammo, more streamlined movement, and considerably clearer environments and a more extensive arsenal of abilities. I will say, however, that the bosses and the entire game as a whole is considerably easier than its predecessors. Now, whether that's a good or bad thing, I'll leave that for you to decide. Nonetheless, even though Kraid and Ridley do have considerably more of a presence than their NES counterparts, neither of them really beat the ever-living sprinkles off of me. And even Mother Brain felt more manageable than the original fight where half of the battle was basically just me trying to figure out what the hell was even happening on my screen, but I will say the difficulty spike here is pretty intense, which is a bit jarring. But as a whole, at least in my opinion, which remember means absolutely nothing, Zero Mission is significantly easier than Fusion, Super Metroid, and especially the original on the NES. But I don't necessarily see that as a weakness because it still feels like it's trying to preserve the ideas that make up the original game's difficulty while not just recreating every single unnecessary frustration simply because it existed within the original. I still got lost, exploration is still enjoyable and meaningful, and upgrades still drastically change the world around you, but I was spending considerably less time fighting against the limitations of the game itself. I would never in a million years wish that the NES version be erased from history, I mean obviously, because getting through that game really did give me an experience that Zero Mission just could never recreate. But if somebody who had never played Metroid, which by the way was me just a few months ago, asked me where they should begin, this would probably be my answer. Just as you guys said in my previous comment sections, I do feel that this is the definitive version of OG Metroid. It educates you in the art of Metroid game design without forcing you to push through some of the clunkier aspects of 1980s game design. Not to mention, visually, Zero Mission is yet another reminder of why pixel art that's done with care ages so insanely well. Fusion had already genuinely impressed me with what the Game Boy Advance could accomplish, which might sound crazy, but you gotta remember, I never had a Game Boy Advance, only an SP, so I had no idea. Ignorant, I know, but trust me, I've learned since then. But Zero Mission uses that same hardware and brings a plethora of life into a world that I had already explored twice. Although both times feeling completely different. The repeated environments and pitch-black backgrounds of Nestroid have been completely replaced by caverns, machinery, and Chozo architecture that give each area a sense of history and substance, while the brighter colors and quicker animations make this version of Zebes feel completely different from Super Metroid. The soundtrack matches that energy as well, taking familiar songs and transforming them into something considerably more energetic and adventurous. Super Metroid is still more atmospheric for me, but I mean, the atmosphere of that game is so insane, it's almost not fair, but Zero Mission isn't really trying to recreate that same desolate version of Zebes. As we know, I've been here before. I know these creatures, I know who Ridley is, and I know that random block in that random corner is probably hiding something of significance. So giving Zebes an energy that's a bit quicker and more adventurous when it comes to freedom was a smart choice, and one that fits unsurprisingly well. But then your boy defeated Mother Brain, and after way longer than I'd like to admit, I began my escape and thought, alright, that was a pretty damn good remake. I understand why all my boys and my 3% female audience wanted me to experience it so badly. And then the game just kept going. Instead of ending at the point where Nestroid ends, you escape Zebes, only for Samus's ship to be intercepted and shot down by space pirates, which sends you crashing right back onto the planet without the power suit I had just spent the entire game acquiring. That meant no missiles, no OP arsenal, just Samus in the Zero suit, hell yeah, carrying a stun pistol that made it feel like I was trying to defeat heavily armed aliens with little more than Buzz Lightyear's laser pointer. And just in case you didn't get that reference, it doesn't do anything. And especially after playing Metroid Fusion, that sudden vulnerability felt all too familiar. The SAX works so well because it temporarily changes the entire relationship between Samus and everything around her, and Zero Mission creates a slightly smaller version of that feeling by again taking your power away. Suddenly, the same space pirates that I would have completely destroyed without even batting an eye became enemies that I needed to watch, avoid, and occasionally haul ass away from. The new Chizodia and Space Pirate Mothership areas make that shift all the more effective because, after spending the majority of the game aggressively tearing through rooms, I was suddenly moving through old Chozo ruins and watching patrol routes while trying not to be seen. Thankfully though, the stealth section doesn't last long enough to become tedious or annoying, which was an initial concern I had. And taking Samus's power away makes getting it back feel all the more satisfying. One minute I was attempting to hide because of a stupid space pirate looking in my general direction, and the next shortly after I was regaining my power suit. But I wasn't just regaining my power suit because after completing the Chozo Ruins test, Samus obtains her fully powered suit, allowing all of those mysterious upgrades I'd been carrying around to finally reveal themselves as the Plasma Beam, Gravity Suit, and Space Jump. And just like that, it's a bad day to be a space pirate, I'll tell you what, because Samus Aran is back, baby. And this was really when Zero Mission became more than a well-done remake. Chizodia, the Zero Suit, Mothership, and the inevitable confrontation with Robo Ridley give the final act something completely its own, expanding Samus's first mission instead of just simply retreading it. It also makes the entire game feel like one big demonstration of the progression Metroid has always been built around, because Zero Mission spends hours making you stronger and stronger, which in turn makes you more confident, only to then briefly take everything away so you fully feel how much you've actually gained. And then it gives it back just in time to let you tear through everything that you'd been avoiding just minutes earlier. When I reached the end of Zero Mission, there wasn't really any question which version of this adventure I'd rather play. Zero Mission is faster, smoother, easier to navigate, and filled with mechanics that simply weren't possible in 1986. But I'm also extremely glad that I got to play the original first because now I understand what aspects of the original all of those improvements were, well, improving upon. A map means so much more once you've had to draw one for yourself. Even though, as I said, I really did enjoy doing so. Visual landmarks mean a whole lot more once you've been completely lost inside of nearly identical rooms, and the smoother progression means a lot more once you've experienced how brutal the foundation underneath it can be. As much praise as I gave Nestroid and as much as I truly do respect his legacy, it still frustrated the ever-living hell out of me, but that frustration gave way to a newly found context, and Zero Mission very much so benefits from that. Again, it's probably the easiest Metroid game that I've played so far, but the entire adventure moves quickly. And knowing that there are always alternate routes, sequence breaks, and advanced techniques hidden right underneath the paths that I may have already taken, made me curious about how different yet another playthrough could be. When I take a second look back at the 4 Metroid games that I've now played, Zero Mission feels like the perfect game to bring everything that I've experienced up until this point full circle. The original taught me the blueprint of the Metroid formula and just how clear the vision was from the very beginning. Super Metroid showed me a perfected version of that formula. Fusion proved that Nintendo could change the structure without losing what made Metroid Metroid. And Zero Mission takes everything I've learned along the way and brings it right back to where it all started. Super Metroid is still my favorite, while Fusion probably has the strongest narrative and easily the most memorable individual threat with the SAX, but Zero Mission might be the cleanest version of a Metroid I've experienced so far. Not necessarily the deepest or most difficult, but the one where everything gets out of your way and just lets the formula do its thing, all while maintaining that phenomenal atmosphere. Samus feels incredible. The level design is masterfully done with exploration that's constantly rewarding. The game gives you enough direction without constantly telling you what to do, and the entire adventure moves with enough confidence that its relatively short length feels like a strength instead of a limitation or negative. After 4 games, I think I'm finally starting to understand that there isn't one specific ingredient that's responsible for why I keep enjoying this series as much as I've been. It's that gradual transformation where you start off weak and limited, and the world at first feels extremely unfamiliar, and over the next several hours, both of those things change in tandem. You find abilities while learning the environment. Areas that once felt eerie and dangerous become places that you can fly backwards through without even really thinking about it. And eventually, the world technically never gets any smaller, but it's wild how it feels like it has because you finally understand it. Every Metroid game I've played has managed to reach that point, but all of them have utilized separate paths to achieve it. Metroid Zero Mission somehow takes one of the best yet roughest beginnings within all of gaming and completely rebuilds it into something that feels fast, confident, and timeless while refusing to forget what made the original special in the first place. And it's easily one of the best Metroid games I've played within this series, and it really is probably the one I'd recommend first to anybody who's wanting to experience a 2D Metroid for the first time. And that of course means that Metroid Zero Mission is a certified banger here at the Milky Donut. And with that, we come to the end of our time travel journey. As always, I had an absolute blast playing Metroid Zero Mission, and to say that I'm excited to experience the Metroid Prime series would be an extreme understatement, so stay tuned for that. But do you prefer old games or new games? Let me know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video and you want to see more of this, feel free to leave your recommendations in the comments as well. The brand new subscriber of the week is none other than T Petty Zen, because you, my friend, are a loyal member of the channel and have been in my community spotlight for the past week with all of your comments. Thank you for being such an amazing guardian of the glaze. As always, don't forget to like, comment, hype, and subscribe to become a guardian of the glaze, and I'll see you next time on the Milky Donut.